bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome to the podcast. Connor Boyack is here with me, and we have Adam Steinbaugh joining us from FIRE. And Adam, I'm going to defer to you to define what FIRE is. Some people are going to picture that we're all sitting around playing with matches. Actually, you are working with an organization doing some really pivotal work across the country today.
Well, FIRE is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and we are a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that works to defend civil liberties on campus. And that primarily means freedom of speech and due process, which, as you can imagine, has been a little bit in the headlines as of late, and we've been kept very busy over here.
And what's the role that you play with FIRE?
I put on a number of hats here. I am an investigative reporter, and I'm what's called a program officer, which means I write angry letters to universities that are infringing on civil liberties, encouraging them to adopt a path which respects civil liberties in the Constitution.
Let's start maybe at the outset, Adam. I think a large criticism that a lot of people have with especially higher education is that it's very left-leaning. Is it your perception that a lot of the free speech problems that arise on campus is due to this ideological trend that a lot of campuses have?
I think there is some of that to a certain extent, but there are a variety of forces that grab the censorship levers, so to speak. I think that there are certainly people that are view or have a politically correct sort of ideology or viewpoint, and they will try to use the levers of power to silence or to quiet people that they view as offensive. But likewise, you also have state legislators and, for that matter, national legislators who place pressure on universities to silence other types of speech. So wherever there is someone with some type of interest on a university campus, they are going to be trying to use the levers of power to silence people. So while the left-leaning nature of universities has gotten a lot of the attention in the media lately, there are a lot of cases where it's censorship coming from the right, which doesn't quite get as much attention.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit about free speech and campus. It used to be the cliche, or at least the prevailing idea was, well, you go to a university or you go to an institution of higher learning to be exposed to new ideas. It was to encounter things you would not encounter, sitting at home doing nothing, or merely working in the factory. But it seems like it's a very dangerous place to speak out freely today. In fact, professors, I think, are sometimes indicating they're afraid of things that they would include in their lessons for fear that it will come back in some form to harm them or their career. Is it safe to say that free speech means something different on today's campuses than it did maybe 30 or 40 years ago?
Well, I wasn't around 30 or 40 years ago, so I can't really speak to what it meant back then. I do think that people are speech can be chilled on a college campus, and I think you see a lot of that as of late. To the extent, what the driving forces might be or how that has changed, I can't really speak to that. I don't know what the data might be on that, but there are certainly a lot of forces on campus which may chill speech.
Adam, talk to us some about some of the legal battles that you've had with FIRE. What's the avatar? What's the standard use case that you see on campuses that you guys are fighting against? Is it protests? Is it clubs trying to, express themselves? What's kind of your average scenario where you guys are intervening on behalf of some of these students?
It is all over the place. Right now, we have a lawsuit pending in California concerning a community college which established a tiny free speech zone on campus and made students get permission before they could do something as simple as pass out copies of the Constitution. So free speech zones are a big deal that we work with, but we also have cases dealing with what are called bias response teams. We have professors who are being terminated because they went on Fox News or some other news channel, or something controversial they said caught attention, and it's just easier to fire them and get rid of the controversy. We have student organizations that attempt to become recognized or get funding on campus and are told, well, we don't want to fund political groups, or we already have too many clubs and we don't want to fund another one. It's coming all over the place.
So let's talk a little bit about professors who may say something online. And I know this spills into other areas than education, but since this is the focus for fire, in your opinion, should professors be held accountable for things that are done maybe on their own time? It sounds like it could potentially come back to bite some of them, things that were done entirely, in their private lives.
I think it depends on what you mean by held accountable. If by held accountable you mean that the professor is criticized, condemned.
I was thinking more like terminated.
Terminated, generally that's not a good idea, especially if it's something that they say on their own time. In that situation, it doesn't really have a bearing about whether or not they're good at their jobs and what it is that they are doing in the classroom. And we want professors and people on campus generally to be able to say controversial things. And if the baseline is that you've offended a lot of people online and that should terminate, that should be the end of your job, that doesn't make a campus a very speech-friendly place.
Adam, you talked about these legal challenges are kind of all over the place. Talk to us about some of the successes. Are you guys finding that the courts ultimately side with your arguments and are generally ruling in favor of free speech, or is this an uphill battle that you guys are waging?
I think that courts generally are receptive to our arguments. Certainly whenever a school has imposed a speech code and it is challenged in court, almost universally or perhaps even universally, courts have looked at speech codes and said, no, you can't restrict speech in this manner, and they have struck them down. But there are going to be challenges moving forward in terms of the types of cases that free speech advocates take and trying to establish new precedent to make speech a bit more free on campus.
Adam, one of the things that caught a lot of attention in the area where Connor and I live, last night, Ben Shapiro spoke on the University of Utah campus, and it was interesting the amount of controversy that a simple speaking engagement would create, but also the security precautions because of the protests. And apparently there were at least as many protesters as attendees at his speech. Have we reached the point where something as simple as a speaking engagement now is an exercise in campus security and crowd control? Does that say something about the larger status of free speech on our campuses?
I'm not entirely sure. Certainly, there has been an increase in the number of sort of raucous protests that require police attention in order to prevent them from getting out of hand. I think that presents a number of risks to broader speech on campus generally, because I think that the more that you introduce law enforcement to political speech, even speech that you disagree with, that is not always a great combination and presents some considerable risks. I think that crowd control and dealing with large crowds is not something that is necessarily new to campus police. Certainly you see police dealing with large crowds after, say, football games. But the return to large protests on campus might seem to be a recent phenomenon. But if you look back at the 1960s, there were certainly very large protests on campus that would often shut down campus for days at a time. So it's not necessarily something new, but a recurring theme.
One of the things that we commonly hear in response to these protests and these campuses trying to demonize or oppose speech that they don't like are these terms, snowflakes and safe space. Is it your perception that within the past, let's say 5-10 years, things have changed? Is this a function of the millennial generation being characteristically different? Or is it your perception that these battles have been happening for longer than that, and that this, safe space mentality is perhaps misplaced as the problem?
I think that, there has always been sort of I think that the labels, snowflake and safe space and that sort of thing, I think it is people are creating labels for old terms or for old ideas. I don't know how new it is. And I think that the unfortunate thing about terms like snowflake and safe spaces is that it allows someone to come up with their own definition for those terms and then use it to assail people that they disagree with. And the unfortunate part is that people assign different definitions to those terms and wind up talking past each other. So I don't know if it is a new phenomenon necessarily, but trying to get people to talk to one another, creating these new terms, I guess, presents a new difficulty.
Talk to me about someone battling with fire for these free speech issues. So far, our conversation has been somewhat in the abstract, kind of the policy wonk, but what does it mean personally to the people that fire is working with? What's the emotional impact here? Is this just something that's kind of inconsequential that someone from a Young Americans for Liberty Club wanted to pass out a constitution and, oh, shucks, they said I can't? Or is there some emotion and potency behind this issue where it really is impacting to and matters to people?
Well, I think there are two different types of reactions. With regard to someone who is told, oh, you can't pass out the Constitution or you can't roll around a free speech ball, it might be hey, this is wrong, and they may feel very strongly about that, but they might not be very emotionally upset about it. That said, the people that respond to that kind of censorship by saying, yes, I'm willing to file a lawsuit, or yes, I want to stand up for my rights, when they do that, that also helps people who might not have stood up or might not have recognized what their rights are in that situation. So by eliminating speech codes, by eliminating regulations, and by standing up for their rights, they're helping other people. And I think that that has effects that we might not personally see, but will be felt on campus. The other type of reaction is that a lot of speech that we work to protect is very, very meaningful and very personal to people. So, for example, one of the cases that we worked with was a school in Michigan was telling students who had indicated that they were suicidal or were experiencing thoughts of self-harm that they shouldn't be sharing that with their friends and their roommates because it might place a burden on their friends and roommates that they might not know how to deal with or they might not want to deal with. And that, to me, it offends me personally that a university would tell someone you are dealing with a very trying time in your life and you should not discuss that. I think that that kind of case, I think, shows how important it is that we protect free speech wherever it arises, because it can be very meaningful, very personal, and very important.
Adam, one of the issues that you had mentioned when we were emailing back and forth, setting up this interview, was the area of sexual assault adjudications on campus. And there was a specific, you said the Department of Education's rescission of a Dear Colleague letter mandating a lower standard of proof. Can you give us the thumbnail sketch of what that issue entails?
Well, essentially, during the Obama administration, the Department of Education sent out what's called a Dear Colleague letter, which advises universities about how the Department of Education interprets the law. And what they said is that Title IX will require a preponderance standard of proof in sexual assault cases. And under federal law, what you are supposed to do when you want to impose a new standard or a new interpretation of the law is you're supposed to give the stakeholders and the public an opportunity to give their comments and their view as to whether or not that is a worthwhile or a proper interpretation of what the law requires. And so the Obama administration skipped the notice and comment method or the requirement of soliciting feedback, and instead said this is what Title IX requires. We disagreed with that. We believe that if a university wants to have a higher standard of proof, if they believe that due process is important to them, then they should be permitted to do that, or at least be able to voice their concerns and say, this is the standard that we want to have. Within the past several weeks, the Department of Education has rescinded the Obama administration's Dear Colleague letter and has indicated that they're going to go through the notice and comment phase of moving forward with their interpretation of Title IX.
Let's talk for a moment about, rather than the specifics, let's talk about kind of the aggregate. What are the implications of limiting free speech? If FIRE didn't exist, if these battles were not being waged to protect free speech on college campuses, what do you suppose the broader long-term social, cultural, political consequences might be of putting the rising generation through these institutions where dissenting views and controversial views were limited or prohibited?
Well, I think that if you go through if you attend a university and you graduate and you are conditioned to accept that a dean or a police officer or an administrator or someone in authority can say, here are the things that you cannot talk about, and here are the regulations that we are going to impose on your speech, then people are going to be conditioned to accept that in the broader world as well. So, for example, there is, and the problem with that is that if people are conditioned to that, they're less likely to stand up for their rights outside of the university. So, for example, there was a university, as I recall, that was in Georgia, where the students were protesting outside of the gates of the university, so on the public sidewalk, and they were holding signs. And the local police came along and said, we have this statute or this ordinance in town that says that if you want to have a sign, we need to be able to look at it first so that we can approve it, and it can't be bigger than some amount of inches by some amount of inches. Thankfully, the students in that case got in touch with their local ACLU, and the ACLU has started raising this as an issue there. But these are the type of regulations that, if you don't stand up for violations or threats to speech wherever they arise, including on a campus, then I think people will be conditioned to accept them in the future.
Are there any other issues that you see on the horizon that people would be wise to, stay on top of?
Well, one of the things that I've been paying close attention to are what are called bias response teams. And what this is colleges have figured out that courts will keep striking down speech codes that say you can punish a student if they say the following things. So what they've done is they've created what are called bias response teams. And what they do is they tell students, if you encounter speech that is offensive, either in the classroom or online or on campus somewhere, fill out this form. You can fill it out anonymously, and we will review it to determine whether or not there's been a policy violation. And even if it's protected, we still may take steps to address the speaker. So what I did is I looked for every bias response team that I could find on college campuses, and I found several hundred of them. And then I looked at who was sitting on these so-called bias response teams to figure out, who is reviewing speech to determine whether or not it is acceptable. And it turned out that a significant percentage of the teams involved campus police or law enforcement. So you have campuses literally setting up speech police to figure out what speech is impermissibly biased. And that, I think, one of the more troubling aspects of that is that if you ask people to report speech that offends them, what you get is a lot of political speech. And you get a lot of people contacting college administrators and law enforcement saying, someone has said something that is politically unacceptable, you should launch an investigation. And often they will. And I think that is a troubling development for our society.
Okay. Adam, we will link to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. And just a reminder to our listeners, this episode is societyandthestate.com/35. And Adam Steinbaugh, thank you so much for taking some time to visit with us. I suspect this is an issue we may have opportunity to talk about in the not-so-distant future.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Adam. Talk to you later.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.